Good evening. You're listening to the Xtreme Movie Show. I'm your host, Rob. From the Great Midwest, I have RDV, and not to be confused by the Kiss song Christine 16, we are going to be talking about what it means to feel 16, which means a car. We're talking about 1983's Christine movie, headed by John Carpenter, of course, based off a Stephen King book. And RDV, I got to tell you, there was a time way back in the 80s when cars to men meant freedom. It meant the opportunity of meeting members of the opposite sex or same sex or whatever sex you would choose to identify to go out and meet in your car. It meant freedom, everything American and all that. So we have Stephen King and a nice little throwback where an evil car gets possessed and turns Cunningham into kind of a bit of a stud. And we kind of get to see what happens here too. But I have to tell you, growing up as a kid in the 80s and watching this, it's actually a pretty good high school movie because we were blessed with Fast Times at Ridgemont High, one of the best of all time. And this one that really gives you a sense of how difficult it can be and not do it in such a cutesy sort of John Hughes way. And I kind of like this film. I don't really watch it that often, but it's a bit darker than what I remember rewatching it recently. And I gotta sit there and say, I still think it holds up well. And oh my gosh, I only wish John Carpenter stuck in with doing some more Stephen King stuff or vice versa. It seemed at that time like both would go nuclear. I mean, it was just insane how positive this combination was. Unfortunately, we only got one of them, but I think Christine's a pretty solid film. Now, from where you're at, where the high is probably only 42 today and bleak, you might like having a possessed car to get you out of the house. What's your take on this film? First watch?
Actually, it's 60 degrees.
Okay.
But no, this movie this is my first impression. This is like my third time watching this movie, and I'll say this: every time I go to watch this movie, it's a new experience for me because I forget everything that's happened in this movie. I just know like, oh, guy gets a car, and then people get murdered, and I always forget that John Stockwell's in this.
Yes.
John Stockwell is the true star of this movie. The guy who plays Arnold, Keith Gordon, he's pretty much he starts off as a normal kid. Yeah, he's been picked on. His parents are complete dicks to him, controlling. And he sees his car. He becomes obsessed with his car. He builds it, put together. His friend, Dennis, is just kind of like doesn't like this car. Like, he basically goes in and sneaks in to look at because basically what it is, he takes the car to his parents in the driveway. So he takes it to this, you basically bring it in, you fix it, yourself, garage, one of those old junkyards.
Yep.
And I'm trying to remember who the guy is, the older old man in here, but the old man in this one, the guy who owns the garage thing.
Mm-hmm.
Just a
The
phenomenal.
guy that sells him the car you're talking about.
No, no, I'm not talking about. No, I'm talking about
okay.
the guy, the junkyard guy.
Okay.
The guy where he allows him to fix up his car inside. And that guy, he said that he's got to be from something else. I think it's Robert.
Sure
Robert. No, that's what it is. Robert Prosky. That's what it is. That guy is phenomenal in this movie. And I love the fact that the way he just talks down to the kid. He's like, but he basically doesn't want punks in here, And the guy's like, and I bet you catch you smoking here. I love it. So John Stockwell goes up behind him. He basically says, but sir, those guys are smoking. You should go tell them to quit smoking. And Prosky just turns around, just looks, and he's like, oh, you're a wise guy. He's gonna get your friend kicked out of here. I'm just like that. Every time I see Robert Prosky in this film, he steals the spotlight. Same with John Stockwell. I mean, and of course, Leigh, who becomes the potential girlfriend for Arnie. Played by Alexandra Paul. Basically, most people know her from Baywatch. She was
that's true.
Mitch's girlfriend.
Yeah.
But this is one of her first roles. Kelly Preston plays the hot blonde that has a thing for the jock Dennis. Those who know Kelly Preston, it was the late wife of John Travolta. And then you said George LeBay, Robert Blossom. That's the guy who basically sells him the car, I believe, right?
Well, for me, when I looked at this and you're talking about all the actors in it, if you're just watching it, like if you're younger and this is the first time or you're not too familiar, you're just like, oh, it's on, let me check it out. Most of these people aren't going to look familiar. But for, you and I going through and dissecting a lot of 80s films and films really all over the place, we go, oh, this person looks like this one who looks like that. And it's hard because like even one person you didn't even bring up was Henry Dean Stanton, who has of course been involved in some other John Carpenter films, and,
He's
also in Twin Peaks. He recently passed away, I think, within the past year or so. But their acting is pretty good. And Kelly Preston, this is her pre-Scientology John Travolta days, if you will. She was in some things and then really broke out big, but you wouldn't know that unless you're like, oh, I'm checking this out, or even know what Baywatch is, because even that's old by today's standards. But yeah, I mean, Arnie with Keith Gordon is your typical, somewhat nerdy kind of guy. And he's not ugly, but he just has an overbearing mom, which is a theme that you get. And I'm gonna present this thought to you here. We talked before a little bit about how with John Carpenter's vampires, how that's kind of like a Western, but also near dark, which is also an 80s film. With vampires, of course, is late 90s. So I always think of those two together as being Westerns. This one's kind of not. But one thing that you definitely see in a lot of these films, which is weird, is this overbearing mom and the really non-present husband. And when I say non-present, meaning he's usually just reading a newspaper or do what your mom says. And so you understand how Arnie is a nerd by early 80s standards. But, you know, it's interesting because the dynamic with him and his buddy, who's like a cool guy, they get along pretty good. And like I say, a lot of this is how do you deal with being a bully? And so, of course, Stephen King goes the supernatural route, and he's only able to do that once he falls in love with this car and he gets kind of possessed by it. And, you know, a similar type of possession type thing is Lord of the Rings, right? It's not the power of the ring. It's being seduced by the thought of what power and what you can do with it. And so Arnie gets this car. The old man who sells it to Tom says in a very memorable line, "It's got the greatest smell in the world." What's that? Pussy, you know?
Yeah,
and, the car starts healing itself. It's like a puppy. It takes a liking to him. And it just gets kind of bizarre as you're watching this go on towards the end. And I'm not going to say I like the ending, but it's appropriate. But to see someone like, not even Kelly Preston, when we talk about Lay in here, she's just a natural beauty, gorgeous. We're in high school, you're like, oh my god, she's in you know, whatever, but she seems like a nice girl, not the gum chewing ditzy blonde bimbo that in the 80s everyone always liked to throw opposite you to say, okay, that's your standard. She seems like she would be a nice catch. And so it's almost kind of interesting to see Arnie and her and get along, but then you see Arnie really go the jock route and really kind of move at a pace faster than what she's comfortable with, and you're like, oh, Arnie, you got some juice in you, and now you're really overdoing it. So it's really watching him spiral out of control. That's what makes this movie fun.
Yeah, and it's not just that though. It's the way she says, the way the car, you know, she just doesn't feel. She almost feels like the car is jealous of her, and like, you know, and just the way to get, because basically the car would turn on the radio and stuff, and it's so. What's really cool, great about this is that how they build the story up. You know, Dennis, you know, originally sees Christine. You know, Christine. Like, you know, he basically goes to look at the car in the garage, and it's not even nowhere near being built. The next day at the football game, you know, he's going to play. He sees Wale making out with Arnie in front of the car, and the car's breaking out, and he gets distracted. He's a receiver, and he ends up getting sacked, and this is where we start getting really, really kind of like eerie, like what's going on with this car? Because we know in the very beginning, there is in the factory, one guy got his hand closed on the hood. The other guy thought he was going to smoke in there. He dropped it on the plastic. When they go at the shop, they heard the music playing. They pulled him out. He was dead. So there's already 2 deaths.
Yeah.
At this point, you're like, okay, what's going on? Like, you know, especially if you didn't see the trailer for this, you have no idea what's going on. You just know that, like, hey, there's like. Normally, that can happen to you. You know, you can have the hood fall on your hand and accidents happen. You know, things are, you know, faulty, whatever. But the guy died in there.
Yeah.
So at this point, you're thinking like, okay, something's going on with this car. You know, and is it anything to do with the guy who died in there, who was pulled out, or is it something completely different? You know, you got the old man who sold it to him. He's very shady and stuff. You know, this basically really it seems like you really want to get in the car and he's gonna move. He says, "Don't come back." So what's his basically John Stockton, he got, you know, he was sacked, you know, his Dennis is the name of the character. He's basically in the hospital. Arnie goes to visit him, and he says like, yeah, he's like, dude, it's like I lucked out. He's like, you know, because he's got a leg and he's got his arm in a cast. He's like, if I would have landed a little bit differently, I would have been paralyzed for life. And
Yeah.
and you gotta think about it, though, where he fell and got sacked was in the vicinity. It was really close to the car,
Yeah.
and the fact that the car was brand new, which so something's going on with the car. So then our next clue is going on with this is that while he's still in the hospital for the next 6 months or a couple months,
He's laid up.
he's laid off for a while. Basically at the drive-in, you see Arnie with Lay, and they said that they're making out in the car. It's raining. She doesn't want to get with them. She's like, he's moving too fast. She runs out, and then he basically chases after her. And he's like, nobody really He's like, he's pissed off because nobody likes his car. He's not really pissed off, but he makes it kind of that little line. He's like, "Oh, I guess nobody really likes my car." Like the way he says it, it's like almost like a revelation. He's like, he can't believe himself. So later on, they go back in the car, and she hits a seat. Now and they're sitting there, and then she goes to eat her burger. He notices that the window wiper blade stops. He goes out there, goes to fix it. The car turns on, the lady turns on, and then the car starts burning up. The door's locked, and she starts choking.
Yeah.
So and he can't get in. She manages to get the door open and pull the lock up and pull out, because if it had been electric lock, she would have been screwed. But she pulled the door open, got up. The guy gave the highway over, and you see Arnie's the whole time. Arnie, since day one, Arnie's been just obsessed with the car. He's been changing. He's been all the time. He's not hanging out with Dennis anymore. So my favorite part of this is when Dennis is finally healed up. He goes out, he talks to the old man that sold him the car, and he learns the history that the guy's wife shot herself with in the passenger seat. Daughter choked on a burger in the car. So you're like, what is going on here? It's like, and as it goes through, it's like, yeah, you basically start to realize that this car is either possessed. And at this point, who's possessing it? Is it the guy's brother who died in the car with exhaust running? He committed suicide, or is it he possessing it? Because I'm going off what the book is. The book, is different. But I don't know if it follows the same as the book. The movie does. They never really said. But but there's different things. You don't know. Like I said, I don't know who. What do you think?
I think that for me, it's the way they end the movie basically is Christine gets destroyed. It gets pieced together in metal. But of course, we get to hear the music at the end with the car, a little bit of it. Maybe it's coming back to life. I kind of like that. What disappointed me at the ending, though, is unfortunately, I think any of us that have had an obsession growing up that we got into, for a lot of guys, it was a car. So sometimes it's something else. But I think the fact that what makes it Arnie, even though he's kind of the bad guy, sorta, he's really not. He's just wanting to not be a nerd. He wants to become a man. So it's really a coming of age film. He's meets the pretty girl. He learns how to be with her. Of course, the glasses come off. He's not a nerd anymore. But he even has to deal with Buddy Repperton, who I have to just get this out here. He's the guy that has some of the best mutton chops of all time, and he looks like a bullet. This guy looks great in here of torturing him, because him and his crew come in there to beat the crap out of him, and it's one of those movies where you just go, okay, I see what's supposed to happen. And at the end you go, well, how is it supposed to resolve? And as cool as Christine is, I find myself almost rooting for Christine and Arnie, even though he's kind of a schlubby nerd who kind of really didn't do it on his own because he had Christine's help. But we don't really care. And unfortunately at the end, it turns out that the jock and his girl kind of work together to defeat Christine, and it's a little bit of a letdown in a way, but it's still kind of satisfying, because on the surface you go, how are you supposed to have a possessed car react, and how are you going to have a third act within the film? And I think it does it pretty well in here, because the visuals are pretty spot on.
Yeah, I like Arnie. He crashes the car, tries to murder him with the car, and he ends up dies himself. And then they crush the car, but then like get a cube at the end, and you see that the car is pretty much like it starts playing the song again, or starts not playing a song, but it starts moving a little bit, trying to rebuild itself because it's done that before. That's that they basically drive it over with the bulldozer. Yeah. So that was crazy. And then, like I said, other people were murdered by the car too, like cut in half and stuff. And and Harry Dean Stockton was a detective, basically suspected. Like they had the guy is the guy bullies who basically crap took a crap on his car, and beat up. It's like you didn't report that. It's like he's like poop comes off, cleans right off.
Now I know right now I'll close with this. I know right now the hot franchise for everybody car wise is Fast and Furious. They're up to like 9, 10 or whatever it is now. but I don't consider that a car movie. I consider a car movie. And a lot of people think
No.
Smoking the Bandit or Cannonball Run are car movies, and you had car movies. This definitely is. I don't think car movies get the same. They don't have the same stature anymore because of a lot of younger people aren't driving as quick or have that urge to as they did up until a generation ago. And it's kind of sad in a way because you could get a car for a couple $100 that was reasonable well, and it was one of the first hands-on experiences you had on transforming something and being responsible. And that's why this movie is kind of still very good, not just because it's a good high school coming of age movie and a supernatural horror movie, and of course a John Carpenter flick with great music and visuals, but because it's got that car aesthetic in it too. So I think it's underrated. It's one that does not get talked about a lot, and it's one of the darker films that come out in 1983. And of course, by then everything is ET and happy-go-lucky stuff. So this kind of stuff you don't get to see too often. I definitely think it's worth a watch, though, especially if you haven't seen it.
Yeah.
What's your final take?
My closing thoughts on this, and I'll just say real quickly, there is one more guy I recognize in here. He was you could help him. Stephen Tash. You'll recognize him from Ghostbusters. The guy who basically gets the shock therapy. He doesn't like it. Spits the gum out. He's one of the bullies in this. I was like, okay, this is like 1978. Yeah. But overall, watch it. If you're a car guy, it's a cool movie. Other than that, though, it's pretty tame. They don't really show the gore. So
it's effective. Yeah. It is. It's more of a thriller, I would say.
Your imagination is more like, I guess, use your imagination when it happens to people. But you, like I said, there's some cool actors in here. It's got a cool car, a 1958 Plymouth Fury, which are awesome cars. And yeah,
nice
John
stuff.
Stockwell.
Yeah, Christine, a very watchable film here. I'm glad I got a chance to quickly talk about it here for Halloween 2022 here from the Xtreme Movie Show. I'm your host, Rob, alongside RDV with me tonight talking about it. Thanks for watching, guys. Thanks for listening, as always. Remember, stay extreme.